The night shift at an emergency dispatch center is rarely quiet. Phones ring, radios crackle, operators move from one crisis to another with practiced calm. Every call matters. Every voice on the other end could mean the difference between life and death. But sometimes a call comes in that changes everything. It was just after midnight when the line lit up on console station 12. The dispatcher on duty that night had already handled dozens of calls. Some were routine. Others carried the tension that comes with emergencies. Yet nothing in the flow of that shift hinted at the moment that was about to arrive. The system logged the call like any other. Incoming line, unregistered number, connection active. The operator answered immediately, following the protocol that had been repeated thousands of times in training rooms and dispatch centers across the country. On the recording, the moment begins with the faint sound of breathing. At first it is quiet, barely noticeable beneath the low hum of the connection. The operator waits, expecting a voice to follow. Sometimes callers hesitate. Fear, confusion, or injury can delay the first words. Seconds pass. Then the breathing grows louder. Dispatchers are trained to listen carefully to every detail. Background noise can reveal location. A distant siren, a passing train, even the echo of footsteps can provide clues. But in this moment, the line offers almost nothing. No traffic, no voices, no movement, just breathing. The operator leans closer to the console, listening through the headset as the call timer ticks forward. Dispatchers know that silence on the line can be as important as spoken words. Silence can mean danger. It can mean someone is hiding. It can mean someone is unable to speak. Then the voice finally appears. It is low, strained, barely above a whisper. The recording captures only a few words before the line begins to distort. Words that investigators would replay countless times in the weeks that followed. Words that would leave the operator staring at the console long after the shift ended. At first, the message seems incomplete. The caller struggles to speak clearly. The voice fades in and out as if the phone is being moved or covered. The operator asks the required questions: location, name, nature of the emergency. But the answers never come in a way that makes sense. Instead, the caller says something else. Something that doesn't follow any expected pattern for emergency calls. Something that sounds less like a request for help and more like a warning. Then just as quickly as the call began, the connection breaks. The timer on the dispatch screen freezes. 38 seconds. For most people, a dropped call is nothing unusual. Phones lose signal. Batteries die. Connections fail. But for emergency operators, every sudden silence raises a question. Why did the line go dead? The dispatcher immediately attempts to reconnect through the callback system. The number appears briefly on the screen before the network returns a message that offers no useful information. The call cannot be completed. Within minutes, a report is filed. Supervisors are notified. The recording is flagged for review. The number is forwarded to investigators. At first, the call seems like many others that come through the system every week. A voice in distress, a disconnected line, a location still unknown. But something about this call refuses to settle into the usual routine. The operator who answered that line cannot explain why. Perhaps it was the way the caller hesitated. Perhaps it was the tone of the voice. Or perhaps it was the final sentence spoken just before the connection ended. A sentence that would soon echo far beyond the walls of the dispatch center. Because behind that call, behind those 38 seconds of audio, there was something else waiting quietly in the background. Something that investigators had not yet seen, and something that had already begun to move. The recording lasted only 38 seconds. In the world of emergency dispatch, that length of time is almost nothing. Calls often stretch for minutes while operators gather details, guide frightened callers through emergencies, and relay instructions to responders. But some calls never last that long. Some end before the real story begins. By the time the sun rose the next morning, the recording from the midnight call had already been archived in the system. To most people in the dispatch center, it was just another incomplete emergency report waiting for follow-up. But the operator who answered that call could not move past it so easily. Something about the voice had stayed with her. Dispatchers develop a kind of instinct over time. After years of listening to people at their worst moments, they begin to notice small details others might miss. The pace of a breath, the way a sentence begins, the hesitation before certain words. Those details had begun to trouble her. Late that morning, she requested the recording again. Inside the small review room of the dispatch center, the audio technician opened the file on a monitor. The sound system was designed for clarity, allowing investigators to pick apart even the faintest noise. The technician pressed play. The breathing returned first. It filled the room in a slow, uneven rhythm. Not the breathing of someone running or struggling violently. Instead, it sounded controlled, like someone trying very hard not to panic. The dispatcher listened without speaking. Then the whisper arrived. Even through the enhanced audio, the voice was fragile. The words were soft enough that the technician had to increase the volume slightly to make them clearer. Still, the sentence came through in fragments. The operator heard her own voice in the recording, asking the usual questions. Her tone was steady, the result of years of training. Location. Name. What is happening? But the voice on the other end never answered directly. Instead, the caller spoke in a way that felt strangely disconnected from the conversation. Almost as if the words were not meant for the dispatcher at all. The technician paused the recording. "Listen to this part," he said quietly. He moved the timeline back a few seconds and replayed a section near the end. At first, it sounded like nothing more than faint background noise. But when the technician adjusted the audio levels, another sound began to surface. A movement. Light, controlled footsteps somewhere near the phone. The dispatcher leaned forward in her chair. The caller had not reacted to the sound. There was no shift in tone, no sudden change in breathing, no attempt to acknowledge that someone else might be nearby. Instead, the voice continued speaking in that same quiet way, carefully, deliberately, as if every word had to be chosen with caution. The technician slowed the recording further. In the final seconds before the call ended, something else could be heard. It was faint, almost hidden beneath the static of the line. Another breath. Not the caller's. The dispatcher felt the tension rise in the room. If the audio was correct, it meant the caller had not been alone. Someone else had been standing close enough for the microphone to capture their breathing. The technician stopped the playback. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. The dispatcher had handled emergency calls for nearly 8 years. She had heard fear, anger, desperation. But this recording carried something different. The caller had sounded careful, controlled, like someone who understood that every word might be overheard. That realization changed the way the call was viewed. What had seemed like a broken connection now looked very different. It looked like a call that had been interrupted. Somewhere beyond the dispatch center, a phone had gone silent after 38 seconds. And standing near that phone had been another person, someone the caller never mentioned, someone whose presence could only be heard in the background, someone who, until that moment, investigators had not known existed. But now that faint second breath in the recording had raised a troubling possibility. The voice that had reached the emergency line might not have been the only voice in that room. 38 seconds. That was all investigators had. In the world of emergency response, most calls come with clear information. A location, a name, a description of what has happened. Even when callers panic or struggle to explain themselves, there are usually clues that lead responders in the right direction. This call offered almost nothing. No clear address, no confirmed identity, just a quiet voice, a few broken words, and a connection that vanished before answers could be given. Yet for the investigators assigned to review the call, those 38 seconds were enough to begin a search. Every emergency call leaves behind a digital trail. The system records timestamps, signal routes, and fragments of network data that can sometimes reveal where a call originated. Dispatch technicians began their work before the morning shift had fully settled into place. The call log was pulled from the dispatch database. The number appeared first. It was unfamiliar, not tied to any previous emergency call in the system. A quick database search revealed no subscriber information attached to it. Prepaid phone numbers sometimes appear this way. Devices purchased without registration can move through the network without leaving much personal data behind. Still, every phone must connect to a tower, and every tower keeps records. Within hours, the network provider had been contacted. A formal request was submitted to trace the path the call had taken through the cellular system. These requests are routine during investigations, but they require careful review. Signals bounce between towers depending on distance, terrain, and network traffic. Sometimes the results offer a precise location. Sometimes they narrow the search to an entire neighborhood. When the first report arrived that afternoon, the information created more questions than answers. The signal had connected briefly with a tower on the outer edge of the county. The tower itself served a wide area, stretching across miles of wooded land, scattered farm roads, and a handful of rural communities. The coverage map showed long stretches where houses appeared only occasionally between forests and empty fields. Investigators marked the region on a digital map. It was a large area to search for a call that had lasted less than a minute, but the signal data contained one detail that caught the attention of the technical team. The phone had not remained connected to the tower long enough to fully stabilize its position. Normally, when a call begins, the network adjusts the signal slightly to maintain the strongest possible connection. This call ended before that adjustment finished, which meant the phone might not have been stationary. It might have been moving. The dispatcher who had taken the call listened again as investigators worked through the data. She sat quietly in the back of the operations room, watching as technicians moved between screens displaying signal charts and coverage maps. Each replay of the recording made the details sharper in her mind. The breathing, the whisper, and that second breath in the background. The possibility that someone else had been standing nearby was no longer just a theory. It had become part of the investigation. The team attempted a callback once more that evening. The system dialed the same number automatically. The line rang. Then it disconnected. No voicemail, no message. Just silence. By the end of the day, investigators had narrowed the signal's origin to a rough corridor of land stretching nearly 15 miles across the county's northern boundary. Several rural roads ran through the area. A few small towns appeared along the edges of the map, but most of the region was quiet countryside. Fields, tree lines, long gravel driveways leading to houses set far back from the road. It was the kind of place where a phone signal could appear for a moment and vanish without drawing attention. But investigators understood something important about calls like this. People rarely contact emergency services by accident. Someone had reached out during those 38 seconds. Someone had chosen that moment to speak. And somewhere inside that wide stretch of land marked on the map, there was a phone that had connected to a tower just long enough to send a message. A message investigators were only beginning to understand. Because behind that signal, behind the quiet voice captured on the recording, there was a location waiting to be discovered. And whoever had been standing close enough for that second breath to reach the microphone might still be there, watching, waiting, and aware that the search had begun. By the second day of the investigation, the map on the operations screen had become the center of attention. The signal from the midnight call had already narrowed the search to a wide rural corridor, but investigators needed more than a general location. They needed a place, a structure, a point where the voice on the recording might have come from. Telecommunications analysts continued reviewing tower data, adjusting signal patterns and coverage strength. By measuring how the phone connected during those brief 38 seconds, they could estimate where the device had likely been positioned when the call reached the emergency network. It was careful work. Every variable mattered. Terrain elevation, signal interference, tower orientation. A hill or cluster of trees could shift the connection by hundreds of meters. But by the afternoon, the technical team had something they did not have before. A smaller search zone. The highlighted region now covered only a few miles along the northern edge of the county. Within that space were several farm properties, 2 quiet roads, and one small town that appeared on the map like a cluster of dots surrounded by open land. The town had a population barely large enough to support a single gas station, a grocery store, and a school. From a distance, it looked peaceful, but investigators know that appearances rarely tell the whole story. A patrol unit was dispatched to begin a routine welfare check across several addresses that fell inside the estimated signal range. These visits were meant to be quiet and methodical. Officers would ask simple questions, confirm that residents were safe, and move on. Most of the houses revealed nothing unusual. Front yards with parked vehicles, porches with empty chairs, windows reflecting the quiet afternoon sun. People answered the door politely, confused by the unexpected visit, but cooperative with the officer's brief questions. No one reported hearing an emergency call the previous night. No one mentioned distress, but one address remained near the edge of the search grid. It stood apart from the others. The property sat beyond the last paved road leading out of town. A narrow stretch of gravel curved through a line of tall trees before reaching a modest house positioned at the far end of the lot. From the road, the house was barely visible. The structure itself looked older than the surrounding homes. The paint along the siding had faded unevenly, and the yard showed signs of long stretches without attention. Weeds pushed through the edges of the driveway. The windows were dark despite the daylight. An officer stepped out of the patrol vehicle and approached the front door. Knocking echoed against the quiet property. There was no answer. The officer knocked again. Still nothing. The house appeared empty at first glance, but investigators have learned that silence can hide many possibilities. A house that seems abandoned may still hold activity inside. A second officer walked around the perimeter of the property, checking windows and side entrances. No movement, no voices, no signs of anyone responding to the presence of law enforcement. But as the officer circled toward the back of the house, something caught his attention. One window near the rear wall had been left partially open. It was a small detail, easy to miss unless someone was looking closely. Inside, the room beyond the window appeared dark. The officer leaned slightly closer, careful not to disturb anything that might later matter. The air inside the house carried a stillness that felt unusual, not empty, just quiet in a way that suggested someone might have been there recently. Back at the front of the property, the first officer examined the driveway more carefully. The gravel surface showed tire impressions that looked fresh enough to have formed within the past day. A vehicle had been there. Recently, the officers returned to their patrol vehicle and radioed the update to investigators coordinating the search. The property would require a more detailed look. At that moment, the house at the edge of town became more than just another address on a map. It became the first place investigators could connect to the call. Somewhere inside that quiet structure might be the phone that had connected to the emergency line. Somewhere inside might be the voice captured on the recording, and possibly the person whose breathing had appeared in the background during those final seconds. For now, the house remained silent, but the silence no longer felt empty. It felt like something waiting just beyond the front door. By late afternoon, the quiet property at the edge of town was no longer just another address on the investigation map. It had become the center of attention. After the patrol officers reported the partially open window and fresh tire impressions in the driveway, investigators moved quickly to secure the scene. A formal welfare check had already justified the first visit, but the new details raised a more serious question. If someone had been inside recently, where were they now? A small team of officers returned to the property with permission to enter the house and confirm whether anyone inside required assistance. The gravel driveway crunched beneath their tires as the vehicles pulled to a stop near the front of the home. The property remained quiet. No movement behind the windows, no sound from inside, just the soft wind pushing through the tall trees surrounding the yard. The front door was locked, but the partially open window at the back of the house provided a legal point of entry for the welfare check. One of the officers carefully raised the window the rest of the way and stepped into the darkened room beyond. Inside, the air felt still. The first room appeared to be a small kitchen. The counters were mostly clear except for a single glass sitting near the sink. A faint ring of water marked the surface beneath it, suggesting the glass had been placed there not long ago. Another officer entered behind him. They moved through the house slowly, announcing their presence as they followed procedure. Room by room, the structure revealed small details that felt unusual when placed together. The living room held a couch and a narrow coffee table. A television sat across the room unplugged. Dust had settled along the edges of the furniture, but the floor showed faint signs of recent movement. The hallway led to two bedrooms. One appeared untouched. The bed remained neatly made, the closet door slightly open, clothing hanging undisturbed inside. The second bedroom told a different story. The bed sheets had been pulled halfway off the mattress, as if someone had risen quickly. A phone charger rested near the bedside table, but the cable hung loosely without a device attached. On the table itself sat something that immediately caught the attention of the officers. A prepaid cell phone box, empty. The packaging had Been opened recently. The plastic seal was torn cleanly across the top, and the instruction booklet had been left inside. The officers exchanged a quiet glance. Prepaid phones are common, but the discovery mattered for one reason. The midnight call to the dispatch center had originated from a number that appeared to belong to an unregistered device. The officers continued through the house. In the bathroom, a faucet dripped slowly into the sink. The mirror showed faint streaks as if someone had wiped it quickly with a towel. But it was the final room at the end of the hallway that caused the officers to stop. The door stood slightly ajar. One of the officers pushed it open gently. Inside, the room appeared to serve as a small office or storage space. A desk sat near the wall with a chair pulled away from it. Papers were scattered across the surface, some partially folded, others torn. On the floor beside the desk lay a phone, not connected to a charger, not powered on, just resting on the carpet as if it had been dropped. One of the officers carefully lifted the device using a gloved hand. The screen remained dark, but the model matched the type often sold with prepaid service plans, the kind of phone someone might use briefly before discarding. Outside the house, the evening light was beginning to fade behind the tree line. Inside, investigators had just discovered the first physical object that might connect the property to the call that had come through the dispatch system the night before. But as they looked around the quiet room, one question grew louder than the others. If this was the phone used to make the call, then the person who used it had been inside this house less than 24 hours earlier. And now that person was gone. Gone without leaving a clear explanation. Gone without answering the questions that were beginning to surround that short recording. But the empty phone lying on the floor suggested something important. Whoever had made that call may not have expected investigators to find this place so quickly. And if the phone had truly been used to contact emergency services during those 38 seconds, then somewhere nearby was the person who had picked it up, spoken into it, and dropped it before disappearing into the quiet roads beyond the edge of town. Most emergency calls fade from memory once the shift ends. Dispatchers are trained to move from one situation to the next without carrying the weight of every voice they hear. If they didn't learn to separate themselves from the calls, the job would become impossible. But some calls refuse to disappear. For the operator who answered the line that night, the 38 seconds of audio had begun to follow her long after she left the dispatch center. By the third day of the investigation, the case had already moved beyond the control room. Officers had located the house at the edge of town. A prepaid phone had been discovered inside. Analysts were reviewing the call recording again and again, studying every fragment of sound. Yet the operator kept returning to the same thought. Something about that voice felt incomplete. She had replayed the recording several times during the investigation review sessions. Each time the same details surfaced. The breathing, the hesitation, the careful choice of words, and that faint second breath somewhere near the phone. It was that second breath that stayed with her the most. The caller had spoken quietly, but there had been awareness in the tone, awareness that someone else might be nearby. Operators learn to recognize when a caller is hiding information. Sometimes people lower their voices because they are afraid of being overheard. In domestic incidents or hostage situations, the caller may speak indirectly, hoping the operator will understand what they cannot say openly. The dispatcher began listening again with that possibility in mind. Late one evening, after most of the daytime staff had gone home, she sat alone in the audio review room with the technician who had first isolated the background sounds. The recording played through the speakers once more. This time she focused on the pauses between words, the spaces where the caller seemed to hesitate. The technician slowed the playback slightly, stretching the audio enough to expose small shifts in tone. The dispatcher leaned closer. There was something in the way the caller paused before speaking the final sentence. It was subtle, but noticeable once the playback speed changed. It sounded like the caller had turned their head slightly away from the phone, as if they were looking towards something or someone inside the room. The technician rewound the clip and adjusted the volume levels. In the background, another sound surfaced that had not been fully clear before. A small movement. Fabric brushing against something. Possibly a chair. Possibly a hand against the desk. The dispatcher felt the tension rise in the quiet room. The caller had not sounded alone, but the most unsettling detail came in the final seconds of the recording. Just before the line disconnected, the caller's breathing changed. For a moment, it grew sharper, not louder, but tighter, like someone suddenly aware that time was running out. The dispatcher closed her eyes briefly as the recording ended. She had heard thousands of calls during her years in the dispatch center. Some had been tragic, some had been chaotic, but this one carried a different weight. It felt unfinished. Investigators believed the prepaid phone discovered in the house might be the device used during the call. The timing matched closely enough to support that possibility, but the discovery raised another concern. If the caller had been inside that house when the call was made, and the phone had later been left behind, then the caller had left the house without it, which meant the call had never been meant to continue. The dispatcher removed her headset slowly. Across the table, the technician waited for her reaction. She spoke quietly, not about the location, not about the phone, but about the voice. "There was someone else there," she said. The technician nodded slightly. The recording suggested the same thing. And if the operator was right, then the midnight call had not just been a voice reaching out for help. It had been a voice speaking while someone else stood close enough to hear every word. Someone who never spoke. Someone whose presence could only be heard in a single faint breath, captured by the recording. And somewhere beyond the quiet house at the edge of town, that second person was still out there. Unidentified, unheard, but very much part of the story investigators were beginning to uncover. By the time the dispatcher returned to the review room the following week, the investigation had grown in scope. Analysts were no longer focused solely on a single 38-second call. They had begun examining months of emergency call logs across the county, searching for anything resembling the unusual patterns discovered in that midnight recording. Most calls followed expected rhythms: traffic accidents, minor fires, medical emergencies. Voices carried panic, confusion, or desperation. But something about this case did not fit. The operator's instincts had always been sharp, but as investigators combed through records, her concern deepened. At first, the similarities were subtle: calls appearing at late hours, lines disconnecting abruptly, voices that paused in ways that felt calculated rather than accidental. A series of low-volume noises, sometimes faint breaths or soft shuffles, captured just at the edge of clarity. Alone, each call might have seemed isolated. Together, they began to reveal a pattern. Analysts created a digital map, marking the locations of each disconnected or unusual call. While many points were scattered across rural areas, a surprising number clustered near roads and properties with limited accessibility. Long driveways, heavy tree cover, isolated homes. The kinds of places where a voice could emerge, briefly reach the network, and vanish before anyone could respond. The dispatcher listened to a dozen of these recordings in sequence, her notebook filling with observations. In every one, she noted the hesitation before words, the controlled breathing, the faint background sounds. Each call ended abruptly, often mid-sentence. Each call carried that lingering sense of someone, perhaps unseen, near the device. Investigators began cross-referencing the unusual calls with missing person reports. At first, nothing lined up perfectly, but after careful review, they discovered that a few calls coincided with reports of people disappearing without explanation. In every instance, the location of the call was only approximate, but the correlation was enough to draw attention. The pattern also revealed a rhythm. Most calls occurred between midnight and 3 a.m., a window of time when few people were awake and responders might be slower to arrive. The operator noted the consistency of the pauses, the subtle noises, and the measured tone of the callers. Each detail hinted at someone who understood how to manipulate the system, how to speak without revealing too much, how to vanish before they could be traced. Analysts ran the call data through audio enhancement software, isolating sounds and frequencies too faint for the human ear. In nearly every instance, the faintest background sounds could be amplified to reveal small movements, rustling of fabric, or distant floor creaks. These were the signatures of someone hiding in plain sight, careful to avoid detection, yet leaving traces just enough to be noticed if someone listened closely. The operator, reviewing these patterns daily, realized the calls were no accident. Someone was practicing, testing the system, studying response times, and choosing each word with care. It was methodical, controlled, intentional. By the end of the week, the dispatch center had compiled a list of 12 calls, small fragments of audio scattered over several months. Each one bore the hallmarks of the first call: measured breathing, unusual pauses, faint background presence. Investigators now had evidence of a sequence that suggested more than a single incident, a voice that reached out in moments of urgency, a second presence always near, always silent, and a system that, until now, had been unaware that someone was carefully observing, testing, and planning. Somewhere in the county these calls had originated. Somewhere the person responsible had been leaving fragments of themselves behind, threads waiting to be traced, patterns waiting to be uncovered. And as the operator listened one last time to the dozen calls, she realized the calls were only the beginning. Something larger was unfolding, and behind the scenes, someone was still lurking, watching, and calculating the next move. By the time investigators began cross-referencing the unusual late-night calls with missing person reports, the quiet corners of the county began to feel less empty. Every call, once an isolated signal, now hinted at a larger story. Something deliberate, something that left subtle traces behind while keeping the culprit just out of reach. At first, the connections were faint. A teenager reported missing from a small town, a man who hadn't returned from an evening walk, a woman whose car was found abandoned along a gravel road. On their own, these disappearances seemed coincidental. But when analysts compared timestamps and approximate locations, a pattern began to emerge. A handful of missing persons corresponded closely with calls that had ended abruptly. Calls with the same hesitant breathing, the same faint background noise, the same short-lived, controlled tone. The dispatcher who had taken the first call was pulled in again. She listened to recordings side by side with the missing person files. Names, ages, descriptions, last known locations. Every detail was cross-referenced with a digital map that highlighted where each strange call had originated. Something clicked. A line appeared connecting each instance, revealing a corridor that stretched across several rural districts. Each missing person had last been seen near that corridor, often within a few miles of the location suggested by the call signal. Detectives began interviewing families of the missing. They asked the usual questions: routines, relationships, recent changes. But all the families mentioned the same detail. There had been nothing unusual before the disappearance. No arguments, no threats. Just an absence that appeared overnight, as if someone had been erased from daily life. It was the silence that unnerved the officers. Analysts also began reviewing more extensive records from the phone network, searching for devices that connected to the towers in the same corridor during late-night hours. Each trace was fleeting, difficult to pin down precisely, but it hinted at movement. Someone traveling across rural roads, stopping only long enough to make a call, then vanishing again. The mobility of the device matched the spread of the missing person cases. As the investigation deepened, the dispatcher realized the human element behind the calls was even more chilling than the data itself. Every caller she had heard was calculated. Each second of hesitation, every measured pause in breath, hinted at a person aware of observation but intent on remaining undetected. The pattern in the calls was no longer abstract. It now had tangible consequences. People were disappearing, and the subtle traces in the recordings were the only leads investigators had to follow. For the first time, the dispatcher began feeling the weight of her role in the investigation. Each call she had answered, each pause she had noted, was a piece of a larger puzzle. Her memory of that first call, the one that had refused to leave her, became a critical tool. The voice that had whispered in the dark was now connected to real lives that had vanished without explanation. Investigators compiled a chart linking 12 unusual calls to 6 missing persons over a span of several months. Each call had occurred during a late-night window. Each voice had displayed the same hesitation and control, and in each case, the person disappeared shortly afterward. It was the first undeniable link between the seemingly random emergencies and a growing list of missing persons. Somewhere in the corridor that connected these calls and vanishings, the operator realized the person responsible was moving deliberately, hiding in plain sight while leaving just enough evidence for those paying attention to notice. And behind the scenes, there was a presence still observing, waiting, calculating the next call, the next disappearance, the next moment that would draw the dispatcher and the investigators deeper into the unfolding nightmare. The investigation had,